Your relationship with savings don't even realize the value of money. As you mature and take on responsibilities, the relationship you share with savings will make you prudent. And as you reach the golden years of adulthood, your relationship with savings will give you the freedom to relax with dignity. Commercial Bank, building your relationship with savings through years of trust, safety and stability.
In the ever-evolving world of business, Mac Holdings Private Limited has demonstrated its ability to adapt to changing customer needs by providing innovative and customized solutions. Today, we are one of Sri Lanka's most respected, diversified conglomerates with a presence in shipping, strategic investments, aviation, hospitality and leisure, renewable energy, freight and logistics, fisheries and aquaculture, and more. We have been able to expand our presence in the region, providing unmatched expertise, the highest quality and an excellent service. Our remarkable growth is driven by our innate ability to reinvent ourselves. Mac Holdings, we cannot spell success without you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm afternoon to and a warm welcome to everyone who's joined in for this webinar organized by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce in association with BCG. The Chamber Academy is pleased to organize this webinar. My name is Shiran Fernando, and I'll be moderating today's session and providing some initial remarks to set the context before we have our speakers and panel discussion later on. So in the next 90 minutes or so, we will discuss about how can Sri Lanka compete for investment amidst the ongoing turbulence, really a case versus growth and fiscal consolidation, really looking at, given today's context of where we are in the economy and given right now that we also have now reached a staff level agreement with the IMF, where we'll be looking at a very strenuous fiscal consolidation progress. I think the SLA agreement outlined that we want to reach a primary surplus of about 2% by 2024. In 2022, where we will have a minus 4.8 primary deficit. So really going from a very significant deficit to a surplus within a short amount of time will really require a lot of consolidation. But in that process, how can we look at investments, maybe rethink of some of the way we look at tax structure as well. So on the panel, we have a good blend of different expertise. We, of course, have an economist, we have from the services side, as well as one of the key projects, investment projects, or flagship projects that the country is looking to embark on and also derive investment as well. But before we move into the panel discussion, let me first introduce our speaker for today, who will sort of set the context and then lead us into the panel discussion. He's Mr. Natarajan Sankar, who is the Managing Director and Partner at BCG, based out of Chennai. He has extensive background and experience in working in the industrial goods sector, with deep experience across infrastructure, automotive, and building materials. He's no stranger to Sri Lanka, having led multiple programs in the country and worked on the issues or topic of infrastructure and commercialization with many local private sector organizations and other clients as well. So I think this regional local blend will provide us some insights that will help us in today's discussion. To the participants, as you all listen in, please feel free to send in questions to the Q&A box so that we can take that up during the panel discussion. We'll remind the participants to remain on mute and the videos off at all times. And if you have any questions, raise it through the Q&A box. So over to you, Natarajan, and the time is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiran. Thanks for having me here. I hope you can see the screen and hear me fine.
Yes, all good. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll take, maybe the next 10-15 minutes to set a little bit of context on the topic you laid out on how Sri Lanka can compete for investment in this turbulent time. But I'll just take a sort of step back to talk about the overall context of FDI, the opportunity itself. And as you had said, we can go a little bit into economic clusters and the role of one of the large economic clusters, Port City. And then I'll take the example of a sector where there is a lot of potential as you look at it from an economic cluster or a country point of view to see how to think about it. So I'll actually take a slight step back from the current environment to look at the overall picture and talk about that. And in that context, then, we can get into the discussion in the panel on how the current environment and the sort of situation feeds into that, right? So to start with, I think overall, when we, look at the opportunity of FDI, the FDI overall developing economies inflow of FDI as a mega trend is rapidly increasing globally. If you look at a 15-year level, the level of FDI into developing economies grew at about 6.4% CAGR compared to about a 4.6 CAGR for developed economies. And of this, the mix within Asia Pacific, again, was significantly larger. So if we look at global FDI and within that Asia Pacific as a part, there is sort of a significant share, which, Asia takes even among the developing markets. Globally, again, as we look at supply chains and how they have evolved over the past 5-7 years, and a lot more because of the pandemic and a lot of other both geopolitical as well as economic situations, I think the changing geopolitical dynamics are very clearly impacting the way people are thinking about supply chains. There is a certain level of stagnated internal economic growth, changing international regulations, as well as the presence or risk of trade disputes, which sort of is affecting the way overall FDI inflows are changing. Now, in line with that, when we actually looked at Sri Lanka overall, and we had sort of done work at an Asia level where we were compared sort of tie in, Sri Lanka at an overall level does offer a lot of structural advantages, right? In terms of the geostrategic location, whether we talk about the trade route or, just being a gateway to a large growing region, which is South Asia. We look at the infrastructure in terms of transshipment, export processing zones, the overall cable landing stations, socio-economic advantages in terms of literacy, trade agreements, as well as the ability, having created world-class industries, and in certain industries, raw material availability as well. And at an overall level, pre sort of the current situation and pre-pandemic, a lot of steps had been taken in terms of structural initiatives, economic clusters, which is Port City, which I'll talk about, and also raising the awareness in terms of investments into Sri Lanka through various investment forums, right? But that being said, overall, as we have spoken to investors globally, one of the areas which does come out clearly for Sri Lanka is sort of the lack of a clear brand positioning compared to peer nations. Overall, in terms of cost of doing business and ease of doing business, we are not top in the region. We're in fact lagging behind most peers. And hence the share of FDI from key contributing nations in the region is also hence lower, right? So while there is a very significant opportunity, that opportunity, is there. Are we as Sri Lanka getting an adequate share of the opportunity? There is more to do. Now, as we sort of look at that context, one of the very critical elements globally in attracting FDI, various governments have looked at it, is the creation of economic clusters. It is a very important tool in activating growth of new sectors, because there are a certain set of advantages it brings to bear, whether we look at overcoming economic cost disadvantages by creating very clear and sharp value propositions for a set of sectors. Where the economic cost advantage comes from is actually the growth of co-located ecosystems, which creates competitive advantage. It is also about addressing the short-term local skill gaps, which otherwise may not have happened without economic cluster. And typically, a lot of these economic clusters have also addressed the risks of doing business as well as the ease of doing business, and overall have generated resources for reinvestments through a virtuous economic multiplier effect. We've seen this play out in various geographies, whether we look at Dubai, the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, the Dubai International Finance Center, Singapore overall as a smart nation, the Port Klang Free Zone in Malaysia, multiple free zones and special economic zones in China, as well as in Ireland, the Shannon Free Zone. And typically, if we look at the objective for a lot of this, some of them are specific to a sector, some of them are more generic across sectors. But when we look at the impact, it obviously starts with, the number of jobs. It also, has a multiplier effect on GDP overall. And obviously specific to a certain sector, it does lead to a lot of investments coming in. Now, with that as context, if I sort of look at what does it take for a economic cluster to be successful, it is actually a very clear and deep understanding of the opportunity and investor pools. The second, which often is not done as clearly, is creating a very compelling value proposition, which has to be a mix of financial and non-financial levers. Because as companies come to invest and get in, they are looking for growth, they are looking for their long-term story, they are looking for competitiveness at the base of it. So how do you really create a compelling value proposition using this? And the third is, of course, from an economic zone point of view, getting early wins and securing anchor investors. And for as many successes as I showed on the previous page, there are as many which have resulted in failure and basis poor implementation and conceptualization. Now, in the context of Sri Lanka, obviously Port City has been envisioned as a very important enabler for achieving Sri Lanka's growth aspirations. The idea is to attract a lot of FDI, generate employment at a large scale, develop a holistic, urban center. And of course, at a Sri Lanka level, the opportunity is much beyond clusters alone. But clusters, as I mentioned in the past, provides a very clear opportunity to actually, be a force multiplier and essentially accelerate investment attraction. And just taking Port City as an example, when we had actually looked at a set of sectors, and some of these apply much broader beyond Port City as well, but just to talk about some of the levers we spoke about and creating a compelling value proposition, it is very important to take a segment backward view, right? And as we look at a set of priority sectors, when we had looked at it outside in, there is immense opportunity in information technology, professional services, digital education, and even financial services and maritime, subject to the right overall support being there. I'll just take one sector and talk about it in a little more detail, which is on information technology, just to give everyone a flavor of how we look at it and how we look at investment attraction. And more importantly, how do companies who are looking to invest in this space look at the opportunity, right? So just in information technology, as we look at Sri Lanka overall, and we've done a lot of recent work in this space where we had spoken to more than 30 to 40 leading companies to understand their appetite to invest in Sri Lanka, their openness, their willingness. And while some of this was prior to the current situation, in the space of IT, which I was deep diving on, there is significant opportunity from a investment point of view into Sri Lanka. Whichever subsector we look at, whether it's technology giants who are looking at potential offshore locations for their backend operations, or ITS companies who are pretty much looking at an India plus one strategy, looking at other opportunities to grow, because from an India point of view, a lot of the tier 1 metro cities are exhausted. Either there is a growth to tier 2, or they're very actually open to look at a India plus one opportunity. In the BPO space, there are already markets like India, even Philippines are saturated. Sri Lanka can definitely clearly serve as an alternate location, and IT related training centers as well. Now, again, one critical aspect to look at from a industry point of view is the way the IT industry operates is people look at outposts, then build it into satellite office, and then into hubs. Typically, offshore operations start on a small scale and then are scaled up, but subject to the right set of enablers being in place, the scaling up happens fairly quickly. HCL in Sri Lanka is also a case study where they had started sort of ramping up in large measure. Of course, some of this has to be seen in the context of where the situation is now and how that would scale up. But the opportunity in IT overall is very large. Now, fundamentally, what IT companies are looking for is the availability of the right and quality workforce, getting the presence of that through the right feeder college finishing schools, having the right cost of operations, having the right infrastructure, robust connectivity. Of course, incentives are critical. The ease and risk of doing business is critical. But some of the other elements which start to come in is, a fast-track visa process as they're bringing foreign employees, the availability of residential space for, the folks working there, and geopolitical stability and a non-controversial site overall, right? So when I essentially take a step back into, the success factors and just taking Port City as an example, a very deep understanding of opportunity and target investor pools, especially given the current environment, is also very critical. It cannot be thought through at a very generic level, the pitch. It has to be very specific to target sectors, subsectors, and the value proposition has to be extremely compelling. Now, there is obviously a combination of the starting competitiveness, which will come basis what each of the industries needs, right? For example, IT as a whole, the largest costs are on labor, manpower, just the infrastructure and where they work out of, as well as connectivity, right? So what is the compelling value proposition for the investor, very specific to that sector becomes very important. The next part is the overall legal regime and the regulatory framework. And, obviously getting early wins and securing anchor investors, especially in the context of as Sri Lanka go out and start looking for investments and getting investors in, it will have a multiplier effect, especially given, the current environment and context. Now, obviously, given the current situation, as Shiran, you'd also mentioned, the staff level agreement has been reached. Things are now looking upward. We need to really think of the right narrative for Sri Lanka and specific to economic clusters, obviously in the case of Port City or other economic clusters. Now, one of the critical aspects I had spoken about earlier was also that when we had done a lot of overall work on Sri Lanka as a whole, the 2-3 points which came out is attractive destination. There are clear advantages, but what Sri Lanka stands for as a brand in terms of investment attraction was not necessarily as sharp and clear. The ease of doing business, the risk of doing business did come out as a question. And obviously the current context and what is the right narrative for an investor as they are coming in is super critical. But given all of these aspects as a starting point, thinking through this at a very specific sector and subsector level becomes even more important, because the value proposition, the competitiveness, the pitch, and the brand have to be very specific to the investors coming in. The last point, after which I will, hand it back to you and the panel, is there is a lot of precedence of multiple economies having recovered from financial crisis to sort of come with strong FDI inflows. Taking the example of SEA, where the FDI was affected for a period of 5 to 6 years at a negative CAGR, they really transformed into a stable growth of FDI, which came from different focus areas in different countries, right? The levers of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand took maybe very different from the levers as Sri Lanka we choose to take. But again, emphasizing, on the point that the overarching narrative has to be very clear, and all the more in the context of the current situation, the narrative as well as the brand, and specific to sectors and subsectors, that needs to be thought through very quickly. So with that, Shiran, I'll hand it back to you and pause here. And, happy, of course, to take questions on this, but, we can do that through the panel.
Sure. Thanks, Natarajan. And I hope you'll stick around for the panel discussion as well. There are a few things I'd like to come back to you when we do have the panel in place. So let me now introduce you to the panel. I think a lot of them don't really need any introduction. We have Dr. Dushni Virakon, who is the Executive Director at the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. We have Ashik Ali, who is the chairperson of Fiscal, the Sri Lanka Association for Software and Service Companies. And we also have Tulsi Aluihara, who is the Deputy Managing Director for Czech Port City. And of course, joining the panel will be Natarajan, who laid out the initial remarks as well on the topic. So how we'll hopefully go through the next 60 to 65 minutes, I think, is initially the panel have asked them to maybe provide initial opening remarks, both on their views on the topic from their various expertise, as well as maybe have maybe some initial responses to what Natarajan presented on, and maybe some viewpoints on that. And then we will get into a few maybe structured questions for the panelists. And in between all that, if you do have any questions from the audience, we'll be happy to take it through the Q&A section as well. So we want to keep it as interactive and lively as possible. So do send in your questions. Let me start with Dr. Dushni. If you can start off with your opening remarks, and then we'll have Ashik and then Tulsi after that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Shiran. I listened to the presentation, and I think that sets out some of the key issues that we need to focus on as we come out of the crisis and steer the economy to attract more investment. Now, interestingly, there was the report that is done by the World Bank, the Global Investment Competitiveness Report. They were looking at the environment for FDI and foreign investment more broadly. And they based their findings on a survey of big investors across, I think, about 10 large developing countries to ascertain what is it that investors look for when they make their decisions. And the three things that came up is that they are looking for a supportive political environment, macroeconomic stability, and a conducive regulatory regime. So these are the three top things, and they rank even higher than other issues that you might think investors look at, such as low tax regime, low labor costs and other input costs, as well as access to natural resources, etc. So if we take those three things, a supportive political environment and a macro stability, I think, this is where Sri Lanka has a problem right now in the context of the debt default and the economic crisis, because even though we have now at least got to the first step of getting to a staff level agreement, there are still certain hurdles to be overcome in terms of the debt restructuring negotiations and attracting more funding into the country. So in that context, I mean, the next 2 years are critical. Even the macro stabilization and all the rest of it means that, economic conditions are going to be relatively harsh for the next couple of years. And in that time horizon, investors are likely to take they're likely to shorten their investment horizon in the sense that you have different kinds of foreign investment. We might see a pickup in foreign investments coming into the equities market, perhaps into government securities, where investors can as quickly pull out their capital in the event that economic conditions, the risks arise, etc. So it will be a bit of a struggle for us to steer away from too much of short-term capital and look for FDI. I mean, short-term capital has risks in terms of volatility. They can flow out just as quickly. Now, in the FDI landscape, I think there are four sort of investment types. The FDI that comes in search of resources, the FDI that comes in search of market, FDI that comes in search of the strategic location, and of course, efficiency seeking FDI. Now, Sri Lanka's market is too small in terms of access to resources. I think in investments into our tourism sector might be attracted in that sphere. I think we might see in the next couple of years in FDI that comes into for strategic asset sort of seeking FDI. There may be investors who see this as an opportunity to get a firmer foothold in Sri Lanka. They are willing to bear the short-term risks and costs because long-term there is a strategic purpose for those investments that they make in the country. But what we really want is efficiency seeking FDI, and that is the conduit for new technology, management know-how, as well as business networks, etc. And there is, I think, where we come back to the long-term reform agenda, political stability, policy certainty, etc. And we can start now, but I think the progress to get to that point will take us beyond the next 2 years. We will be facing elections in 2 years' time, etc. So that investments in critical investment FDI into those areas, I think will take a little bit longer. So my final point on that is then, should we strategically look at tax incentives. I know there has been a lot of work that's been done of what investors look for when they make those investment decisions. Of course, macro stability, political stabilities, those are pretty much the top ones. But in a crisis situation like we are in, where we cannot guarantee those, is there an argument to be made to look at tax incentives to attract specific targeted efficiency-seeking investments, perhaps into the IT sector? I think there is a case to be made for that. If you look at, again, a previous iteration of the same global investment competitiveness report, they looked at a whole host of countries and find that at least 50 to 70% of developing countries give certain tax incentives to attract FDI. And these are to be found in most commonly in the construction sector, in information technology, electronics, machinery and equipment, and other manufacturing export sector. So I think we need to spend some time in the next months to figure out, given the fiscal situation, what kinds of tax incentives might work. Where are these, what kind of strategic investments are we seeking to attract, and then get to a full overhaul after we have at least come to some degree of political and economic stability in the next 24 months also.
Thanks, Dr. Dushyant. I think a few important points in particular. The last one you brought on, which maybe we can get into in the discussion round. Let me now move to Ashik for your opening remarks.
Hi, good afternoon, Shiran and everyone who has joined today. Yeah, I think Sankar took our IT sector as an interesting example. Shiran, my audio is okay?
Yeah, just if you can speak a little bit louder, I think it might be. Sure,
okay. So I think Sankar touched upon the IT sector, BPO sector, as an example of what can be the opportunity for Sri Lanka, and he's right. The tech sector or the business services sector is one of the sector globally, even during the pandemic lockdowns, etc., has continued to grow, and the opportunity is huge as more and more businesses, enterprises, governments, public services move towards digital transition. And therein lies the opportunity for Sri Lanka to also attract. And right now, our share of that is quite minuscule compared to some of the countries which have already established their position in this, as well as some of the other countries which are emerging as highly attractive destinations. Some of the things that Sankar spoke of, the ease of doing business, some of the policy levers, Sri Lanka needs to address those if these investments are to materialize into Sri Lanka. Apart from the big attraction, which is the talent, the human talent capital here, there are also Sri Lanka needs to do a fair amount of investment in developing globally aligned skills, talent that can deliver on those. And as an industry, we are focused on these things. We have a fairly long-term, short to medium-term and long-term program in bringing those talent-related matters or initiatives to bear fruit. Yeah, in concluding, this is one area I think where there is immense growth opportunity, and in the current context of the crisis that we have seen in the last 7-8 months, as much as there has been concerns from existing customers, clients, partners, and investors, as far as we know as LASCOM, we haven't seen any loss of employment or large-scale work shifts. If at all, things that moved are purely based on business continuity and risk mitigation in the short term, but the long-term commitments by clients as well as investors still remain. And even during these last 6-7 months, we have seen continued inquiries for expansion as well as new setups.
Thanks, Ashik. The labor side of it, I wanted to get into a little bit more maybe later on. But Sophie, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Shiran, and everybody else. Yeah, so the topic and the question here is: look, we are going to be embarking on an IMF program, right? And significant consideration is given on fiscal consolidation. Now, the fiscal consolidation can happen in two ways, or both. Either you try to increase your tax revenue by taxing more and increasing rates, and also by cutting expenditure. Now, which one is more effective, I will leave it up to the experts, especially Dr. Dushni, to probably comment later. However, the empirical evidence suggests that cutting public expenditure is more effective compared to increasing taxes. Now, the question is, how do you ensure that during this stage, during the fiscal consolidation stage, that economic growth continues, especially for us to reach any level of debt sustainability? Strong economic growth is a must. Now, when you look at evidence of many other countries, including Sri Lanka, who have embarked on very aggressive fiscal consolidation programs, typically it has been at a cost of growth. Now, balancing between the two is quite important. And let's try and see, okay, during this time, and I was glad that Nataraja spoke about branding. It's quite important. Now, Sri Lanka, in terms of the branding as a tourism destination, yes, I think there is adequate awareness. But in terms of doing business destination, probably there's much needed to happen. And also Dr. Dushni spoke about supportive political environment and a macroeconomic stability and regulatory environment. Now, none of these at the moment are in place. So when you're on a fiscal consolidation program, and when some of these prerequisites are not in place, and we still lack the branding from a doing business perspective, how do you ensure private capital, or how do you ensure there is adequate FDIs? Let's try and let me give you show you a comparative analysis of some of the countries. Let me just give me a moment. Can you see my screen?
Yes, so if you can go full screen.
Right. Okay. Now this will show you where Sri Lanka is in terms of compared to some of the regional peers, right? This is our competition, because there is significant competition to attract capital and talent. Now, we have listed down about 5 countries: Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, UAE, and India. And on the last column is Sri Lanka, right? Let's kind of take a moment and see where we stand. We spoke about doing business, right? Rank quite poorly compared to our competition. We have a restricted default rating. And many economists obviously talk about attracting FDIs and tax incentives not being critical. I totally agree. and saying that labor productivity, quality of infrastructure, ease of doing business is a must, which is quite, I agree with that proposition. But the point is, when you look at Sri Lanka and comparatively with some of the other countries, we rank quite poorly, even in terms of the labor productivity, quality of infrastructure, and look at political stability. Now, this was in 2015. So obviously now 2015, we ranked 101. Obviously, this position has got quite worse, you can imagine now. Now, when you look at the tax rates given there across the board, our tax rate in Sri Lanka, the current and the proposed rates are quite high. We are second to India. Now, India demographics are quite different because they have a local market with over 1 billion people that they need to cater for. Whereas we don't have that demographic dividend like India. We are a 22 million population. So as Dr. Dushni also mentioned, the question is, how do we attract multinational companies to set up in Sri Lanka and utilize this platform to access the region? So something similar probably like Singapore. Now, even, and also Dr. Dushni mentioned that close to 50 to 70% developing countries, because of these other shortcomings, they provide tax incentives. Now, if you look at these, even countries like Singapore, who is quite developed, provide up to 40-year tax holidays to targeted sectors, no doubt. DIFC is a great example. I mean, 20 years ago, their growth was saturated, and they have introduced DIFC and few other free zones. Altogether, they have about 20 free zones now, and they really drove economic growth with this dedicated special economic zones targeting specific sectors. So this table should really show where Sri Lanka is, and we should ask ourselves, why would anybody make an investment, especially a long-term investment? Dr. Dushni spoke about short-term investment. Now, in the case of Port City, let me give you an example here. It's a pure foreign direct investment, right? $1.2 billion have been made already. Taxpayers, not a single cent of taxpayers' money was utilized to develop this infrastructure. What we have now is a grade A infrastructure, almost an extension to the existing CBD. Question is now, how do we monetize this? I want to very clearly distinguish Port City development from a real estate development. It is not a real estate development, it is a special economic zone. And for us to be successful, or to be a successful special economic zone, we need to attract multinational companies, businesses. Nataraja spoke about IT sector. So sector specific, some of the trust sectors that the government also may promote. We need to attract businesses to come and set up in Port City, take advantage of fiscal as well as non-fiscal provisions inherent in the Port City Economic Commission Act. And the wider question is, how do we address some of the inherent sovereign risk? Right now, on the bottom of this table, I have put the weighted average cost of capital. Typically, what is used for Singapore, it's 6.5% to 7.5%. This is a dollar return, and for Sri Lanka, it's about 15 to 16%. Finally, it boils down to return on investment, right? And you would typically discount your cash flows with your WACC. And you can imagine, typically, somebody who is willing to invest or looking to invest in Sri Lanka would look at least a hurdle rate, a return on investment of about 20%, a dollar return. And for you to discount your cash flows by 15 to 16%, question we need to ask ourselves is, how do you ensure the feasibility of large projects, especially when it comes to construction and real estate related projects? So I will conclude my remarks, what I would want to emphasize, my concluding remark is that we need to make sure that tax fiscal incentives are given for specific projects. I know in the past, these have not been utilized properly. I think there has to be a proper cost benefit analysis done to ensure that the economic benefit is much larger than the cost of fiscal incentives. Thank you.
Thanks, Tulsi. We're getting a few questions from the audience in the Q&A box. We'll take it up as we go along. If I go back to Dr. Tushni, and then I think picking up from where Tulsi left on the fiscal consolidation side, and clearly on the taxation side as well. I think today's SLA kind of announcement also, and I alluded to this at the start of my remarks, put very ambitious, primary deficit target. We almost have to go from 0.4 negative to 0.5 negative to 2% within 2 years. I think initially we were thinking maybe it'll be 2025, but now it seems 2024. So it's a sharp correction. We've done that in the past, and I think we did that in 2017 and 18, but we did see a bit of a slowdown in the economy at that point as well. And given the contraction that we are seeing, a lot of the indicators, the high frequency indicators, the PMIs, all of that showing a very sharp slowdown, and the lack of real, growth drivers, maybe beyond export-facing businesses at the moment, and consumption, declining a lot because of the slowdown, as well as the declining disposable income and sharp increases in prices of a lot of things. What I want to get to is how do we, really find that balance between, of course, we need to meet the IMF targets and have a trajectory towards fiscal consolidation, but in that process, how do we really get the growth trajectory also back in track? And I think that leads to the investment side of it as well.
The short answer, Shiran, really is that right now, I don't think we have any kind of space to focus on growth, because the key imperative is that we reduce investor risk and increase policy predictability to rebuild investor confidence. That is absolutely essential in order to sort of keep on this track to regain macro stability. I mean, if you look at the IMF funding, that's quite minimal, 2.9 billion, and that's not enough to serve the current needs. So it is in many sense, IMF, it's sort of a catalytic impact or effect, hopefully positive effect in getting other investors to come in. Those can be bilateral, multilateral, and all the rest of it. Now, the adjustment is simply not on the fiscal side alone. When you have the IMF kind of macro stabilization works on 3 fronts. It works from the monetary front, the fiscal front, as well as from the exchange rate front. So what we have is a sharp devaluation, which means prices have increased, and that means consumer demand is going to go down, and especially for imported consumers with or without the current import restrictions. Second is the monetary tightening. That is also intended to squeeze demand. High interest rates hits households, it hits firms, all the rest of it. And fiscal tightening, we are yet to actually come to that, because we have the announcements and some gradual increases in taxes, but the full impact of the fiscal adjustment is still ahead of us. So all these combined impacts is meant to squeeze demand. And that is why we are saying the Sri Lankan economy is going to contract by 8%. This is one sort of criticism of, sharp adjustments that are aligned to IMF programs, because in the interim, as your economic contraction happens, that also means that when growth slows, tax revenue collection also slows. At the same time, when your growth slows down, your debt ratios start to look worse. So at least for a period of 2 to 3 years, we are going to find ourselves seeing sort of a worsening of the growth outcomes, etc. And unfortunately, the emphasis to balance this at the moment, since we are in the situation of having defaulted on debt, and we have to still get our creditors on board, convince them that we have committed to this adjustment and that they will get their money back without the cuts being asked of them being too painful. Creditors' interests have to be also looked after. That means the primary deficit correction from a negative 4.5% to 2% surplus is part of that story. So it is, I think, only after we have got that debt negotiations finalized and start implementing the fiscal reforms, because on the monetary front and on the exchange rate front and on some of the utility pricing, I think all of that has more or less been done. Once we implement the fiscal tax reforms, we've only seen the beginning of the tax adjustments with this interim budget. November budget will have more. Let's say after 6 to 8 months, then we have to start shifting gears to look at growth and how growth can be supported. So there are certain reforms that the government can start doing, which can support that process of supporting growth. But in terms of providing any kind of a monetary or fiscal stimulus to support that growth pickup, that's still a long way off. The government doesn't have the resources to do any public investments as we did in earlier rounds. So they will have to rely on private investment, whether that is domestic or foreign investments, to get that process going. But balancing growth and fiscal adjustments, that's still 6 to 8 months off. We've not reached that conversation yet.
Thanks, Dr. Krishna. I think so. Further slow down before we can really get things off the ground. Natarajan, if I come back to you, I think you showed a few slides, or your last slide was on the key, I guess, the tiger economies during the Asian financial crisis. If you looked at a country like Thailand, I think they had a stronger fiscal footing during that period, and were able to recover. But just from a growth perspective, just trying to kind of maybe draw any comparisons or any lessons for Sri Lanka. How did some of these economies kind of look at growth-related reforms or pushes without looking at too much on the fiscal side of it, or because they had stronger fiscal positions, maybe they had that tool really to assist them? You're on mute.
Correct. And I think that's the challenge many of the panelists have also spoken about, because if you really look at the various levers, right, if you take Thailand as an example, the foreign investment laws are made a lot more liberal in terms of allowing full foreign participation in a lot of manufacturing sectors. In the case of Thailand, there were actually government spending cuts and tax increases, but the financial sector was sort of restructured. The capital requirement, capital requirements were changed. How, the debt restructuring, instead of taking it to court, it was out of court settlements. There were social spending programs in rural areas. Whereas if you take Indonesia, it was very different, coming from a point of view of privatization of the state-owned companies, of course, the liberalization of the foreign trade and investment, but the financial sector was rehabilitated and the bank restructuring was done. and the corporate debt restructuring and bankruptcy laws were brought in. So I think it is always, it's specific to Sri Lanka. Many of the pandits have spoken about specifically what needs to be pushed. And earlier, Mr. Ashik had also spoke about how the IT sector has sort of been bellwether through the storm. We're seeing interest from investments, etc. And Tulsi also spoke about how while what we are going through today, there is a need to be competitive at an absolute level, but also compared to the other peer geographies who are trying to attract the same investment. Because today, as we are looking, over the next 2, 3, 5 years and looking to attract investment and investors in, we are still in a competitive market where other peer geographies are trying to do the same. So it is not only relative competitiveness to where the company is today, but compared to other peer geographies, how we attract those investors coming in. So while it has to be a combination of the starting point, fiscal prudence, but without competitiveness, without ease of doing business, without risk of doing business, investors are not going to come in. So that's the mix which one will need to sort of find and think about.
Thanks, Natarajan. Ashik, if I bring you in, I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box also. In terms of the IT sector, the need for more skilled personnel, how do we solve the problem? There's also a question alluding to, I think, some of the recent import restrictions. Maybe those are more short-term in nature, which potentially has long-term implications, but maybe if you want to respond, you can respond on that as well. And overall, I think just the issue of losing skilled talent. I think whether the industry is really seeing that trend at the moment with the brain drain and migration, and is that coming at a time really when the industry and the associations really propelling and going forward and trying to go beyond 1 billion, 2 billion export targets as well.
Certainly, the talent one is a real big elephant in the room for all of us. I think it's not just IT sector, any knowledge sector. I think seeing a very heightened skill migration out of the country. I was having an earlier discussion with a foreign ambassador, and he was alluding to some of the increased migration visa applications that were coming, and it was just not tech sector alone. It was across the board where knowledge workers were concerned. It's really impacting us because it's actually taking away a talent pool which is in the mid-tier, typically in that 4 to 8 year experience category, which is really critical set of people who anchor deliveries, nurture future talent into the industry. And when you take that, it kind of creates a major vacuum in the middle. So there is no short-term solution to that. Right now, the crisis has kind of accelerated that talent migration. But what we are seeing also is that other major economies are going into recession cycles, right? And we are also seeing, especially in the tech sector, some layoffs happening, especially where venture capital, private equity drying up on the startups. So this should kind of now, it won't even happen immediately, but over a 6 months to a year horizon, people will realize those job opportunities which are right now easily available may not be there. And in those economies, they themselves are feeling pressures in talent through the growth. So what happens is that we have an interesting major Indian company coming here, and they were saying that how the Indian services sector was losing talent to the Indian startup sector because there was so much of startup capital in the system that they were willing to pay a higher order of wages to attract them, and the services sector was feeling the pinch. So similarly, in those economies where when the startup sector starts laying off people to preserve capital, then those people will start finding jobs in the services sector back, and then it dries up, talent migration a bit. But those are just externalities. We can't rely only on externalities. We need to look at internal things as well. So we need to, the demand here has not declined. The demand is there, and especially in our sector, the wages have seen serious increments. But the companies can manage with those increments. It's depreciation related increments as well as inflation related increments. So our sector can manage those cost increases because of the dollar Sri Lankan rupee depreciation. So looking after employees at this time and showing them opportunities here back home, and for the kind of income that they earn, the lifestyle they could have here, opposed to getting locked into in a foreign country in a middle level with a long-term mortgage, etc., to pay off. And some of these countries have personal income taxes which are much higher, whereas in our sector, there is a fairly higher threshold. So these are some of the positives that we can put to ebb the tide. I'm not saying that it will completely take away, because people not also move out mainly also because looking at their children's education, welfare for the next generation. So how do you appeal that and make them here, because we have lost some of these essential things that people enjoy here, the mobility, the education sector, especially in a state and non-state school went into not being able to function properly. So these have kind of caused huge life concerns for people. So those are also needs to be stabilized, and hopefully with the fuel situation somewhat resolved and sectors getting back into work, these might be mitigated. You mentioned another, the import ban. Yes, that was another question from the thing. Yes, this I think has not been thought through. It has a massive impact in the sector. As I said, we continue to grow the sector. That means we continue to grow employment. So everyone who joins requires a laptop, requires a computer, requires ICT infrastructure. Beyond that, to offset the power cuts and the reliance on the on-grid electricity network, we promoted off-grid solar solutions. In fact, we work with both DFCC Bank and the Bank of Ceylon to bring about green loans at very attractive interests compared to what the current interest rates are. And we have seen an uptick of people taking that, both company-sponsored as well as individuals. So now the batteries are also in the temporary suspension list. So this is going to create a lot of current immediate term delivery issues. And then also our university graduates, the talent supply are going to get affected because most of them are into hybrid learning, which requires them to have laptops for them to do their studies, practicals, projects. This is going to have a major impact. We have in fact written to the finance ministry to think through this, the implications, because this is not a luxury consumer item, so to speak. It's an essential business tool. And it's not just going to impact us, it's going to impact any other economic sector, any other business sector, because everyone is into accelerated digitization.
Sure. Thanks, Ashik, for covering those two questions. I think there's a question from one of the participants in terms of, I guess, greater investment protection and ensuring continuity from I guess government to government. We don't have anyone from government really to respond to this, but I think Tulsi, I think this one question probably you get a lot on the road as well, trying to promote Port City. Any responses to that if you have?
Yes, thanks, Sean. I mean, that's a key risk, right? We are trying to address, and I'll come to it. Now, the question is, as Dr. Dushni also mentioned, right? Public expenditure, public investments are going to dry up. How do you ensure growth, right? Purely from private investment. And widely cited example is Denmark. right? In 1980s, they embarked on a massive fiscal consolidation. And also because they managed to continue and attract private investment, their growth did not suffer as a result, right? Now, in Sri Lanka, that private investment, whether it's domestic or international, let's talk about the international investment. And the question is, how do you ensure, how do you mitigate some of these risks? Now, if you take Port City as an economic cluster, as Natarajan said, right, there is a special economic zone law, and let's try and test some of these policies within Port City and use it as almost a reform tool. And there is provision in the law that it can go beyond the area of authority of Port City, meaning the law can be extended beyond Port City. So all those Sri Lanka is or party, we have about 25 bilateral treaties protecting investment, especially against appropriation. History suggests otherwise, right? Any foreign investors, especially on the predictability of policy and ad hoc changes to agreements, concessions when the government changes, right? So during the time of when the Port City law was being designed, obviously we spoke to many investors and we gave our feedback to the government. So there is an inherent provision included in the Port City law that once an investor or a business enters into an agreement with the commission, that agreement cannot be altered or terminated ad hocly. So there is the adequate provisions in the law that once you sign an agreement, once certain fiscal or non-fiscal incentives have been granted through that agreement, those cannot be altered. Then the question is, how do you ensure that there is some sort of a protectionism against adverse impact due to changes in law in the future? As you would know, obviously you cannot bind any present parliaments for that. So there is another provision within the Port City law or the investment agreement, which is called the economic equilibrium clause, which clearly states that if there was any change in laws in the future, and if your business or investment is adversely affected by way of increase of operating costs, there is a compensation mechanism inherent. So that does two things. One is that it gives protection, adequate protection for investors. One is once you sign an agreement, and protection against ad hoc changes in laws, policies in the future. Also, it also protects governments, or it allows governments to think twice before they change any laws or introduce various laws that may adversely impact foreign direct investment. So these two provisions are inherent in the Port City law, and typically when we have tested this with some of the potential investors, they really looked at it quite favorably.
Thanks, Jose. There's a question in terms of on the manufacturing side. Unfortunately, we don't have someone with the background, probably manufacturing, but I think Natarajan and maybe Dr. Dushin, if you want to comment in, the question is what would be the best strategies on attracting anchor investments for global sharing network related manufacturing, in particular in electronic component manufacturing, FDIs. Natarajan, maybe any insights from what you've seen in the region or what you're seeing in terms of potential interest for companies setting up in Sri Lanka, and maybe Dr. Dushin from your understanding of the global trade scenario as it is.
So, Shriram, the electric components, it looked at sort of semiconductors and fab in a large way, even in India. And at some point in the past, I think there was a discussion with BOI on that. The part about this is many of these today are dependent on 2 or 3 aspects. One is, I think as Dr. Dushin said earlier, are there the natural resources which give a certain advantage? Is there a certain market out there where there is an advantage, or I think should laid out the fourth point on efficiency of manufacturing, which in a lot of other cases where there is neither the resources nor the market, it actually comes from very strong financial incentives to make the efficiency work. And at the scale of investment there, at least as you look at some of the larger investments like semiconductors, etc., would also depend on fairly significant financial incentives and investments. At a broader level, honestly, the electric component at a smaller scale, I have not seen deeply. So I don't have a view. Maybe if any other panelists have, would be good to hear that.
Sure.
If I can just add on that, Shiran, I mean, the first thing is that, supply networks, they are very sensitive to disruptions. If there is no confidence amongst investors that once you have, invested in, let's say, in Sri Lanka to manufacture this component, that the Sri Lankan firm or business or a cluster that undertakes to do so is able to deliver. Now, when you have a policy environment in which trade policy keeps changing overnight, there are policy reversals, that does not convey any confidence, I think, to investors that are looking for countries that have advantages in those areas. So first thing is policy stability. Second is that we have to look at a whole host of reforms in the trade sector, because component manufacturing in those kinds of global supply networks depends on there being a fairly sort of low and uniform tariff structure. So you would still have tariffs on finished goods, intermediates, and raw materials, but there can't be huge divergence between those tariff rates. So we are still a long way off from getting there, and we have all of these, add-on tariffs that come as para tariffs. So entire tariff structure has to be re-looked at. And second and most critical is the IT infrastructure. Do we have the network, the backbone IT infrastructure that is cost effective to support manufacturing and industrial sector growth? And third and finally, skills. Sri Lanka is again aging demographic. Unlike the other South Asian countries who are adding labor, more people into the labor market and are able to grow as a result, we have to rely on adding capital per worker. And that means that we have to have a labor force that is able to adapt to technology and adopt new technology. And this is one reason why when even the skilled IT workforce that we have is moving out, it's a very scary sort of phenomenon for the long-term growth prospects for Sri Lanka. So, and then it's sort of in a sense, it relates to an argument that Tulsi made in his opening remarks that the fiscal adjustment should be looking more at the expenditure side rather than the revenue side. I don't agree, because in terms of positioning Sri Lanka as a upper middle income country, government spending in the Philippines, in Malaysia, it's about 26% of GDP. So Sri Lanka is spending only about 20% of GDP. But if we are to spend more on education, on skills development, we have to have more investments in those areas. And unless we raise revenues, how do we invest? Because the expenditure cuts that we can do is only at the margin. The only non-discretionary spending where we can cut is on public sector wages and pensions. So there, politically, sort of, who is the politician that's going to start reforms on the administrative side? It will take us some time to get there. So this fiscal adjustment on the expenditure side is not going to get us to primary surplus as required. So to get to whether it is more complex manufacturing or high-end service production, there are certain fundamental reforms that we have to push through after we pass the first hurdle of stabilizing the macro economy. No investor is going to come if they think, what is the exchange rate going to be in another week or two? So that's the most critical at this point.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. I think we're seeing a lot of comments regarding retaining talent and what can companies do, or what should policymakers do. I know, Ashik, you mentioned a few things that some of the service companies are doing. I'll locally told the panel maybe if they want to, if they have any their thoughts in terms of retaining talent and what can policymakers really do in this instance.
Yeah, I saw a comment from Stein that the talent supply issue was not addressed. So yes, because we are losing the middle tier, it's really difficult to create the next levels of talent as new entrants come into the workforce. Having said that, we are accelerating, speaking to the education providers at university level and at other tertiary level to see how we can attract this more. So SLASCOM is doing some very large scale programs to attract and train to the order of the current output is close to about 13,000 graduates per annum, both from state and non-state sector. And from other tertiary, it's about another 25 to 30,000 people, but they require, as Dr. Dushi said, a lot more training before they can enter the workforce. So we are now looking at how we can attract them, do certain fast-track training methods, which some of the other countries have already done to accelerate that an entrant to a more higher category of work. The other aspect of this is the port city. Once that comes into being, even if the infrastructure doesn't come, if the setting up of companies, etc., come into being, then there is an element of more relaxed labor regulation, especially in the visa regime, which means that especially the captives who are coming in here might be able to bring some of their senior talent to anchor that talent development in Sri Lanka. We still remain a very attractive destination in terms of talent attributes, and this has been very much related to a much lower attrition rate, and that leads to things like our advantage in product engineering for companies which are actually looking at R&D components, looking at innovation capabilities. This is where Sri Lanka has had more success in the last 15 to 20 years. And those talent attributes still remain very much intact. If we can get the next level of talent supply trained, then we should be able to manage the Sri Lanka's competitiveness and value proposition.
If I may just add a few comments here, Shiran. Yes, of course, supply of talent is one. And the second question is, how do you retain them? Right? We lose a lot of talent every year to other countries for much better opportunity. So the question is, if we are able to attract some of these multinational companies, even for IT, right, to Sri Lanka, and give that opportunity for some other Sri Lankans to work for them, then obviously we might be able to restrict or address some of these issues in relation to brain drain. Now, what we did at in Port City is that employees, one is that within Port City, you can employ anybody, whether local or foreign. There is no quota or there's no such restrictions. And there is a streamlined, almost a very efficient visa process as well. In addition to that, because Port City is 100% services export special economic zone, employees who work here will be remunerated in foreign currency. So that's a huge upside, right? Because when I also speak to many Sri Lankans who live overseas, right? If we create the right economic environment, there are many Sri Lankans who are willing to return, given that right opportunity. And I think as a country also, as we look for markets outside Sri Lanka, because these companies will generate revenues in foreign currency, we need to look at compensating employees, at least for export-oriented companies, in foreign currency. Thank you.
Thanks, Sosi. Natarajan, any experience from what you've seen in the region in terms of when countries go through these kind of crises? What policymakers have maybe done, or what firms have done as well? Maybe MNCs could, manage given the wide presence, but maybe domestic related firms may not have that luxury in that sense. Any insights? I think we've lost. He's gone offline, I think, at the moment, but maybe we'll have him back as well. Susi, if I go back to you again, I think on this on the fiscal side of it, and ensuring, I guess, more prudency on the revenue aspect of it as well. I think the key concern with, or something that maybe a lot of people are bringing up is the fiscal incentives the Port City has provided, or it will provide. And how do you ensure kind of that some, certain tax leakages don't happen, and that Port City is actually a positive contributor towards the government revenue picture as well, and maybe companies don't, have undue advantages over local companies. How do you address these kind of issues, which I'm sure has come up in your conversations?
Sure. See, we need to definitely ensure that there is no tax leakage, right? It has to be incremental. So for Port City, it has to be new business, right? So, and also we need to, through regulations, we will make sure, or the Commission will make sure that the profit shifting doesn't happen. So Sri Lanka is a party to OECD guidelines on BEPS, right? So we need to ensure that profit shifting doesn't happen. It has to be new businesses, and there is adequate regulations which is currently being contemplated at the Commission level to ensure that that tax leakage does not happen. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. I think Natarajan, you're back. We were trying to close up the skills discussion in terms of any regional experience that you might have from economies that have gone through crises, and that maybe at a firm level or at policymaker level, what they've kind of done to ensure talent. There hasn't been a brain drain as such. Any insights?
No, I think skill development, as multiple people have called out, is obviously very critical. It has to happen in partnership with obviously the and part of this comes back to which sectors, right? And what are you trying to attract? Because there is nothing called skill development in general without sort of being clear on the target sector, subsector, right? Again, taking IT as an example, which we were talking about earlier. Right, and with Mr. Ashik from Slascom, as well as we have spoken to multiple IT companies in India who are looking for this. The base IT work and base IT skilling and training they're comfortable with. But if we can actually create a niche in certain areas, like for example, analytics or AI and so on, the talent pool which they could sort of tap on becomes much more attractive for them to further expand. Now there is no golden bullet here or silver bullet here for on skilling to say what is one thing which will really solve it. So it has to be very specific to the industry, in partnership with the industry bodies, in partnership with creating and co-creating a program with many other local schools and so on, right? But there isn't a single silver bullet to say this is really one. Yeah, I would just say it has to be very specific to what you're trying to attract rather than generic skill building.
Thanks, Natarajan. So I think we've taken most of the questions coming in from the Q&A box. In closing, if I'd invite maybe the panelists, if they have any closing thoughts, maybe one or two areas that they'd like to see in attracting investments, in particular given the current environment. One, two things maybe policymakers can look at, or even firms can look at to keep their own investment momentum going, or attract new investment to come in as well. So maybe we'll start with you, and or anyone who wants to start off.
Yeah, so Shiran, the question is obviously, with tax reforms, how do you, whilst that is happening, how do you kind of ensure economic growth? And I sincerely believe that you can create certain economic clusters or thrust sectors and incentivize investments or private capital to those thrust sectors. And then Port City can be one of them, where the investment has been already made by the private sector. Now the question is, how do we attract multinational companies to come and set up here to do their export business? And there have been enough independent studies have been done to really ascertain the economic impact of this. And then since or as a country, our primary objective is also export of goods and services, and creating this economic cluster will really help us to move forward during these trying times. Yeah.
Thanks, Josie. Dr. Doshi or Ashik?
I think that, there are simple things that we can do. And I think there is the economic crisis is really, it calls for systemic changes in the way that the government functions. And I think there is sufficient appetite out there amongst the political class, political leadership to at least agree on certain principles. And that is that they will strengthen independent institutions and agencies that make these laws and regulations, and that they will not reverse this once governments have agreed to and signed up on certain agreements. Give independence to some of our policy-making agencies, agree that they will not politicize public policy-making institutions. Certain basics can be agreed on, and these are not necessarily difficult to get through. I think there is broad political consensus to get these things done, so that at least while we get the macro economic sort of conditions sorted out and wait for elections in 2 years' time, there will be some degree of confidence amongst investors that Sri Lanka has turned a corner in the way that it does business, and that even after 2024, even if there is a change in governing arrangements, that we will not go back to the bad old days, and the way that policy making and policy environment will function in a far more independent and predictable and effective manner.
Thanks,
I just Yeah, just want to add two pieces here. One is what this crisis has shown, especially in our sector, is the resilience. It has continued to deliver despite 6-hour power cuts. The workforce has adapted to work, different hours and still manage those. The companies have looked after the well-being of the people. So there is a great resilience piece there. And especially if we go into sustainable energy sources, one of our major forex leakages in fuel, we can positively contribute towards, with 115,000 workforce, some way forward can be shown even for other industries to adopt certain things that we do here for others to also make a similar impact. So that's on one. The other component is also we normally, even Slascom, there's a misconception that we only represent the service sector. But there is another element of our businesses, which are the creation of IP and creation of innovation and products and platforms. And these have an element of also attracting capital in terms of, growth capital, right? And here, what has been happening is as of July 2020, soon after the pandemic lockdown, there is a policy in place, the Order 22, on the outward investment accounts. Now, this earlier had a $500,000 threshold, which then was reduced to 200,000, and then it was brought down to 10. And now there is absolutely nothing, and every 6 months, the monetary policy keep extending. What has resulted is a significant number of Sri Lankan IP creators, product platform creators, have now gone to other countries like Singapore and Dubai to attract that capital and retain those capital in those countries, because the capital is brought in to grow their businesses globally, not because the Sri Lankan 22 million population is not going to give them that market. So you need that capital mobilization to expand into other markets. So that whole investment capital piece in the last 2+ years has not accrued in Sri Lanka, and the resulting valuation of those companies as they go through the multiple growth cycles and multiple investment rounds, all those capital accruals are happening in other countries. So here too, certain policy levers can be changed, and as with the current staff level agreement, some stability confidence measures start growing. That's another place where there can be a disproportionate amount of foreign direct investment that can come in, because in the region, whether it's India in Gujarat Gift City, or in the MENA region, it's Dubai, or in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, there's immense amount of capital, especially because, as Dr. Dulce said, this is a part of the world where there's a very young population, which is becoming very upwardly mobile, young, becoming middle-income earners, and the demand for tech is very high in this area.
Kaushik, I think I really appreciated your second point, which maybe we could have got into a little bit more in the discussion as well. But I think a really pertinent point of things that could have easily come in, but due to the situation hasn't really materialized. Natarajan, I think we started with you. Any parting thoughts?
I think thanks for circling back. I think many of the other panelists covered the critical points. Of course, it starts with the being able to show investors the political and macroeconomic stability, because that is the base for investment. But I think, as Tulsi said and Mr. Ashik also said, economic clusters and specific sector-wise focus as a sort of element for driving growth, we'll need to double down on, because that's where I'm convinced, that it, the sharpness of the value proposition, the ability to go after a set of, real investors is going to come from there. and economic clusters globally have revitalized growth, brought back growth. Port City is a great example here. And specific sectors within that, whether it's IT or financial services, and really need to be sharply looked at to really bring investors in. But it comes from the base of being able to show political and macroeconomic stability, and then adding to the value proposition on top.
Thanks, Natarajan. And that kind of brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much to our speaker, Natarajan from BCG. Thank you for the collaboration as well. And to our panelists, Tulsi, Dr. Dushni, and Ashik. Thank you for providing your candid thoughts. And I think we explored a range of issues when thinking about investment really in this time. But I think the staff level agreement and some of the ensuing reforms provide some optimism that some of the things that we discussed can be really looked at, and we can really put investment back in the picture. Because that's one of the key reasons why we are in this mess, is because we've not really attracted too much of investment in the last decade as well. So we looked at, I think, the skills gap in particular a lot, given the importance of skills in this kind of a market as well, and the whole fiscal consolidation to incentives narrative as well. And I think a lot of food for thought there as we look at shaping our economic reforms in an IMF program and beyond, in which policymakers need to action it as well. So thank you to the audience for speaking on. I think most of you have been patiently listening in for most of the time as well, and for those questions as well. So thank you to the panelists and the speaker once again, and hope to see everyone soon at another webinar or interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiran.
Thank you, Shiran.